and YouTube. Joining us in the Zoom room are not only our moderator and panelists, but also over 40 DHC members, City of Dallas staff, media, and staff from elected officials, including the Office of U.S. Congressman Mark Vesey, State Senator Nathan Johnson, State Representative Rafael Anchia, and Dallas City Council Member Chad West. Thank you all for being here today. We kindly remind all virtual attendees to remain muted and submit questions directly to Dallas Housing Coalition Executive Director Brian Toney using the Zoom chat so he can compile them for audience Q&A towards the end of the webinar. You will be able to go back and watch the webinar at any point on our social media if you need to drop off, but hopefully you can stay for the whole thing. If you are new or less familiar with the Dallas Housing Coalition, we're made up of more than 320 non- and for-profit organizations and individuals with a single mission: to advocate for the creation and preservation of attainable housing across the Dallas region for all. As a grassroots, volunteer-powered organization, we were initially founded to advocate for an investment of $200 million in the City of Dallas's May 2024 bond program to support housing and homelessness solutions. Ultimately, voters approved $82 million across 3 propositions to enable the City of Dallas to leverage municipal funding with private investors and other sources of public funding. More recently, the coalition threw its support behind Forward Dallas 2.0, the City of Dallas's comprehensive land use plan update, approved by the Dallas City Council in September 2024. And we also supported parking reform approved by the Dallas City Council in May 2025. With an adopted legislative agenda approved by our members at the beginning of this year, this was our first state legislative session as an active coalition. We published a legislative tracker on our website to monitor housing and homelessness related bills and worked tirelessly to champion innovative policies designed to tackle Texas's housing crisis, increase affordability, and boost housing availability across the state. I feel confident in saying this legislative session has been a monumental step forward for housing in Texas. While we celebrate this progress, we remain focused on the work ahead to ensure every family in Dallas and across the state has a place to call home. To discuss and break down this legislative session further, I would like to introduce today's moderator, Joshua Fechter, Urban Affairs reporter at the Texas Tribune, and our expert panelists, Emily Dove, Policy Advisor at Texas 2036, John Hill, Chief External Relations Officer at Housing Forward, Ben Martin, Research Director at Texas Housers, and Felicity Maxwell, Executive Director at Texans for Housing. Brian is going to keep us on track to start audience Q&A by 12:40, and we will close today's webinar at 12:55. The virtual floor is now yours, Joshua, and thanks again to each of you, Emily, John, Ben, and Felicity, for joining our panel today.
All right, thanks for having us, Ashley, and thanks for putting this together. The legislature was pretty busy on the housing front this year, and it touched areas ranging from zoning and land use to tenants' rights and areas that would affect homelessness. I want to start off with you, Emily, to tell us kind of like, because this was the area where they were sort of the most active this session, what did sort of state lawmakers do when it comes to basically allowing more homes to be built?
Sure. Thank you so much, everybody, for having me. I've met many of you, but wanted to give a quick intro. My name is Emily Dove. I work at Texas 2036. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan, data-driven policy shop. We are based in Austin, but we have employees in Dallas, Houston, and San Antonio as well. Housing is a relatively new area of policy for us. We started working on it in the 2023 session. And it's been a blast to work on and work with Brian and Ben and Felicity and so many of our other coalition partners. And Joshua is correct. This was a fabulous year for housing and land use reform. There are, I would say, 7 really big bills that will allow for more housing of different typologies to be built in the state. For like expediency's sake, I'll focus on 2 of the ones that I think are important. The first one is HB 24. That was written by Representative Angela Orr. I'm not sure, I'm blanking on where she's from. Somebody else is, for some reason I was thinking Waco, but now I'm confident that is not where she's from. Representative Angela Orr. What that does is reform what we are calling the tyrant's veto, which is a 100-year-old provision of state law that governs how neighbors can protest zoning changes in kind of like nearby where they own property. It is really, really good at killing housing. It is better at killing housing than we have data for, because we know that it creates a chilling effect on development. So builders don't want to build in an area if they're going to have to really fight the neighbors to do so. So that reform really raises the standards for how neighbors can protest zoning projects so that we can get housing built faster. The other one that I wanted to point out was SB 840. This bill will allow for the construction of homes in areas that are zoned for commercial, residential, office, etc. This is going to have tremendous impact in some of the bigger cities across the state. The bill is bracketed to cities of 150,000 people and counties of 300,000 people. So that captures about 18 or 19 cities. And there's a few in the DFW area. Plano, I think, is on there. Maybe what are some other bigger suburbs up there? I have my list on.
There's Plano, Irving, Garland, Frisco, all these places where you're kind of going to see that, it looks like.
Yeah. So all of those areas that really are fast growth suburbs in many respects, now we're going to be able to utilize land to a better and higher use by allowing housing to be built if that is what the market demands. And I think that is an important note to make. This is all really these are market-based reforms. And I think that's going to be really important going forward, even into next session, is kind of continuing to instill the idea that this stuff is going to happen where and only where the market demands it.
And we're gonna spend quite a bit of time talking about those bills, I feel. But first, I want to kick it over to Ben Martin and tell us a little bit about kind of what you were focused on this session. Obviously, the big ticket item that you were looking at was SB 38, which was billed as the sort of anti-squatters bill, but would have had, some pretty wide sweeping effects on tenant protections. Tell us a little bit about kind of like the arc of that bill. Where did it start off and where did it end?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Joshua, and great to be with all of y'all today. My name is Ben Martin. I'm the research director at Texas Housers, a statewide low-income housing advocacy organization. I also lead our statewide advocacy efforts. And as we think about the housing needs of Texans, it's helpful to me to understand it in terms of the economics of housing. How affordable is it? How are we going to make more of it on the one hand? And then the legal frameworks that undergird the housing experience for households in Texas, including the laws that are the foundation of landlord-tenant relationships in the state. So that's a big focus area for our organization. And going into this session, Joshua, you mentioned Senate Bill 38, which was that's absolutely right. That was the big ticket item. This is a bill that was announced by Dan Patrick in the Senate under the title Stopping Squatters. There has been a move on more conservative or right-wing social media and among conservative legislatures then to address the issue of people trespassing and occupying and doing damage in homes that they don't live in, have never lived in, are owned by somebody else. The data is very thin on how big of a problem this actually is, but that's kind of beside the point. Senate Bill 38 did much more than address the issues of stopping squatters. In fact, there was another bill, Senate Bill 1333, that increased criminal penalties for people who trespass and do damage in a home. We could talk about that bill. That's a whole nother can of worms. But the main point here is that under the guise of being a squatter bill, the main stakeholder, the Texas Apartment Association, was working with legislators, Senator Betancourt on the Senate side and Representative Angie Chen Button on the House side, to pass sweeping legislation that would have reworked the Texas eviction process from top to bottom. The intention of this bill, as you read through the 30 or so pages of it, clearly was not to stop squatters, but rather to make the eviction process, which is already in Texas among the fastest in the entire country, significantly faster, an outlier in terms of speed, and then also to surgically go through that process and remove every step and stage of the legal eviction process where a tenant would have a right to defend themselves or to, bring additional evidence into a case, to appeal their case, any protection for a tenant along the way that gets in the way of a speedy eviction was going to go under this bill as filed. But this bill underwent extraordinary changes over the course of session. As legislators became educated about what was actually in this bill, I think my read is that there was a lot of frustration among legislators that this was being sold to them as a cure to the squatter issue, when in fact it was intended to do something entirely different. And then also another issue that legislators were increasingly aware of was just how extreme some of the proposals in this bill were. And so by the time this bill had moved through the Senate and then onto the House floor, what we saw was a bipartisan coalition of legislators, nearly every single Democrat and many Republicans, working to amend and reform the bill to significantly narrow it, and in particular narrow the worst provisions to actual squatters, people who trespass in a home, and not to tenants who are being accused of having a lease violation. So I want to give a sense, the bill is very long and has many, many sections, and it would put everybody to sleep to go through every single one of them today. You can go to our website for a handout that goes through this in much more detail, but I want to hit on a few of the high-level points. In particular, the bill introduced a process that they referred to as summary disposition. Now, in other areas of law, summary disposition is a sped-up process, an expedited process where there's still a trial or hearing in front of a judge. That's not what this is. This process is landlord requests summary disposition. They present their side of the story, their evidence to a judge. A tenant is notified that they have, originally it was 3, then it was 4 days to reply with their own evidence. And if they do not do so in 4 days, the judge may make a determination in the case. Now, this collapses what's currently already one of the fastest processes in the country, 3 weeks, down to 4 days. And you could really see the eviction of a tenant from filing to judgment in as few as 5 days. And we know that the speed of eviction matters, right? The ability of a tenant to, even if they're ultimately going to leave, to avoid housing insecurity, instability, and potentially homelessness, to secure new housing in the future is going to be very challenging in 21 days. I couldn't do it. I couldn't find another place to move to and move there in 5 days. It's just, when you think about the practical reality of that, it's just not feasible. And so the summary disposition process was amended on the House floor to apply only to actual squatting cases, what the law refers to as forcible entry and detainer, meaning that you have broken into a home, you've trespassed, you've never had a lease arrangement there. Other provisions that were stripped from the bill, there was a provision that would have required local governments that fund attorneys that support tenants in eviction court, like Dallas's Dallas Eviction Advocacy Center. If they receive city or county funding, that city or county has to provide equal or greater funding to relocation assistance. These funds are already extraordinarily thin. I'm pro relocation assistance, but forcing cities and counties, kind of preempting their ability to choose how they're going to spend that money in a way that best serves their constituents, was going to be incredibly harmful to tenants. And then it allowed landlords to request their cases be transferred to different courts, so they could basically choose their own judge depending on what they thought would get them the best outcome. All of these provisions were removed from the bill, and summary disposition was restricted to just squatter cases. There are many more like the ones that I just listed, but the headline item is that the harm that the bill would have caused was significantly reduced by the time it passed. And the effort to do that was truly bipartisan. There were a number of legislators from both sides of the aisle that were pretty fired up about this issue and really felt like a bill like this was not needed.
Right. So would you say that tenants, like everyday tenants, renters who, who are not squatters, as much as that's defined, like we'll see any sort of effect uh, their ability to rent as a result of this bill?
I mean, I want to be clear. We're very happy with the outcome. Tenant advocates and tenants should be very happy about the outcome compared to what might have happened. This was very defensive for the tenant advocacy community. This wasn't like a positive bill we were trying to pass like some of the ones that Emily was talking about. And I want to be clear that the final version of the bill that passed still has harmful elements of it, but they're much more contained compared to their smaller harms compared to what had been proposed. So an example of a few things that are still in the bill that are going to be harmful: it creates confusion between state statute and federal law. Some federal housing programs have longer prescribed periods of time before you can evict a tenant. Now this says that you can basically ignore that up to the point where a constable kicks a tenant out of the house. You don't have to wait anymore, the like 30-day period that some federal housing usually would have you wait. You can go through the whole eviction process up to physically removing the tenant, and then you have to wait till the end of the federal period. So that certainly is not in the spirit of what those federal regulations are attempting to do. It's very unclear whether this creates a constitutional issue of state law attempting to preempt federal law. Some attorneys have already argued that, and I expect that we'll see a court case trying to address that issue.
Well, another place where the housing advocates were playing defense was in, helping folks who are experiencing homelessness. John, tell us a little bit about kind of what you saw at the Ledge this year in terms of kind of what lawmakers were proposing, what passed, what didn't, what you were, what was, sort of looking to be helpful, what was perhaps not in your view. Kind of what was the sense of what happened on the homelessness front in the Ledge this session?
Sure. Thank you for the question, and thank you for having me. Housing Forward serves as the lead organization for the COC, the All Neighbors Coalition. And if not for that coalition, which includes a very supportive city, a very supportive county, and about 150 organizations that day in, day out are addressing this issue, there could have been some really dangerous pieces of legislation that made it through, and thankfully did not. And so the one in particular I'm talking about that needed a good amount of defense played against it was SB 2623, which sought to prevent the delivery of navigation services, as they called it, within initially 1.5 miles of a school. One of the challenges with that, as it was originally written, is that given the way that navigation services were defined, it potentially wouldn't have allowed our ISDs to be around themselves, because so many provide support to students that are experiencing homelessness, or operate a peace pantry, or any sort of service that's delivered to a person experiencing homelessness or housing insecurity. And so it went through a couple of iterations, including the reduction of the zone of operation to about 1,500 feet. And also there was a House version that also included public parks, which in a city like ours in Dallas, that seeks to add more green space than almost any other major city, it would have become kind of a rolling human disaster, forcing a great many providers to close their doors. And so through the efforts of, city, county, and, the 150 organizations that are part of the coalition, we were able to make sure that our elected officials knew what the potential unintended consequences of such a bill could be. And it didn't end up ultimately getting out of calendars. Now, the interesting thing for those folks, watching, almost every minute or every hour of our session, is that there were efforts to attach similar language to other pieces of legislation, whether they had anything to do with the unsheltered population or not. In particular, I recall a conversation around water where homelessness was brought up, and the lieutenant governor actually stepped in and, said, keep the amendments related to what we're talking about here. So were this able to move forward, a great many providers would have been not allowed to continue to stay in business. So we're grateful that our elected officials on both sides of the aisle were able to see that this would reverse course in what has really been a nation-leading effort to support our neighbors, the unsheltered homeless neighbors that we have. Now, one piece of legislation, a Senate bill brought by Tan Parker, was encouraging. It was around mental health and those services. Now, that didn't end up getting off of the floor, but it did bring an important amount of awareness to a particular subset of a population that are experiencing, behavioral health crises, and quite frankly, wouldn't be ready for traditional shelter or rehousing or diversion as we think of it. So adding an extra level of compassion to the response, if that had gone forward, would have been very helpful. We have a complex needs working group here in Dallas. That is a big part of how we were able to be successful in addressing homelessness downtown. And what we're seeing now more than ever is that homelessness or housing insecurity are not one size fits all. And the picture that a lot of people have of the unsheltered or the housing insecure doesn't quite match the reality. So we saw some things that were hopeful. And if we get more legislation that is more comprehensive and compassionate, I think that'll be a good thing. But with the special session coming up, I know that I am going to be paying close attention to make sure that we don't see a revival of this attempt to add amendments to get across legislation that didn't make it through the traditional way, but trying to sort of force it in there. And I can't speculate on the reason why, but I think the numbers bear out that efforts like 2623 would be detrimental and would ultimately cause quite innovative method of addressing homelessness to then become unsuccessful.
Thanks, John. So, Felicity, tell me a little bit about the politics of what happened at the legislature this year. This is not an area specifically, I'm thinking of like the zoning and land use bills that the Ledge typically handles. You saw some bills go try to make it over the finish line 2 years ago. They didn't, for the most part. And, this year you saw something different. Tell us a little bit about kind of what happened there and, kind of what lawmakers were responding to.
Yeah, great question. Hi, Felicity Maxwell. I'm the executive director of Texans for Housing. Delighted to be here today and talking to you all about what did well in the Texas Senate or Texas legislation and what we saw. And I think the politics were a great part of this because it was very different from the last session. And I think the point you've probably heard from some of the other speakers is that the discussions around housing, both tenant side, homelessness, as well as what we were focused on, which was sort of that deregulation and zoning and reform, they were in a very different place this session than previously. And I think a lot of that was because of two things. One, honestly, the relationship of housing prices and sort of how housing is viewed in the state. It's been a real rise in price and sort of, the impact of it has been felt, I think, across the state. And the reps knew that when they came into this session. So they'd heard from their own constituents, hey, housing's really expensive, or why are we seeing a rise in homelessness, or, what happens if our eviction courts are full? So those kind of conversations had just matured, honestly, and they were much more, I think, in depth, and there was an awareness that just didn't exist previously about how housing looks and is impacted by state rules. So that's the first thing I would say. I think the other thing that really happened was that there was a lot of education and advocacy, and you can tell from the great folks on this call, both the people who are members of the Dallas Housing Coalition, as well as those of us who worked at the legislative session, there just was a certain visibility to housing advocacy and the level of information and sort of kind of awareness that we were bringing to the table that probably also hasn't been there previously. So, not only were they hearing it from their constituents, maybe when they're doing these town halls in their own districts, but then we were there in their offices talking about all these same issues, why we needed the HB 24 reform, how it was hurting housing, why we wanted to make sure that we could continue to have homelessness services despite the idea of that being needed to be separated from schools. So there was just a level of, I think, work that was there and done by professionals as well as advocates like the folks on this call that probably didn't exist previously. And that infrastructure got built up, quite honestly, over in the interim and over between last session and this session. And then I think the other thing I would also touch on is just that this was very bipartisan. And I think you're hearing that kind of is that there were Republicans who were against some of the tenant stuff, that the worst versions of it. Likewise, when we were doing our housing reform bills, we saw a lot of bipartisan support. In fact, when we looked at our voting, it was really the middle of so it's sort of from the most sort of median Democrat to the median Republican, really across the board supported our housing reforms in terms of things like HB 24, SB 840, which is that residential and commercial bill, the single stair bill, which Emily and the Texas 24 team worked on so hard, Texas 2036 team worked so hard on, that kind of work, I think, became very bipartisan, and it's in a legislation that was really fraught, we'll say, or complex and hard. There were a lot of hard issues that they talked about this session. It was probably nice sometimes to have something like water and housing and things like that, where they could all be basically in agreement. And of course, there were people who were still opposed to, and there were still some bad things that passed. But I think those kind of housing, the education around it, the advocacy, the awareness from the elected themselves, and then also that sense of what can we do as a group in a bipartisan way to address these issues in the most positive way possible. So I think that sort of gives a good idea of how we ended up where we did, which I think, as you can hear from the call, was mostly positive. And I will also say, having been on a few of these Ledge wrap-up calls, there were a lot of other parts of Texas sort of advocacy and policy that didn't do as well as housing. So I think that's another thing that's really interesting to me, is that I'm giving a lot of great reasons why I think the politics worked out in our favor, but those same dynamics weren't necessarily there for other issue areas. So I think it's something to keep in mind, is that we had a lot of success this session. Who knows if that's replicable next session? Who knows if there'll be a different shift? Because I think some folks who do the same thing, they've done well previous sessions, had a really hard time this session. You might be talking about education or judicial rights, things like that. So really interesting to see where the dynamics shifted in our favor and maybe away from some other people who didn't have as much success as we did on our policies this past session.
So, Emily, where do you expect cities to sort of take this now? Because there's a couple things that have to happen, right? They have to implement SB 840. They have to implement SB 15, which is the small lots or small homes on small lots bill, and that's only in some new places. And they also have, SB 840 they have to implement, and they have to implement, they will also have HB 24 kind of in their quiver at this point. What would you expect, or how would you expect cities to sort of behave? Do you think that the cities will have any sort of pushback to the new legislation? What do you sort of expect in terms of their behavior?
Um, you know, I will answer, but you may also want to kick it over to Felicity as somebody who has worked on city level politics for
Sure.
a long time. Implementation can take a really, really long time. There is no state agency that will be overseeing the implementation of these bills, so it does reside solely within the, authority of the cities to interpret the law. I think that there's a component in a couple of the bills that creates a new cause of action for people who are when the law is not followed by the municipality, there is a new cause of action. I would anticipate that will change their outlook on how quickly they should implement the legislation and how in line with the precise wording of the legislation they should be. Undoubtedly, we'll have to come back and do some cleanup next session. That's just kind of how it goes. Our big housing one last session was HB 14. You have like a year and a half to put it into practice. And then there were attempts to clean it up again this session. So for sure, it's kind of an iterative process. We'll have to come back and fine tune things. But I would anticipate that that they stick pretty close to the legislation as passed, especially because like the city of Austin is really working towards some of this stuff already. So hopefully it is not an overwhelming burden on the cities to implement.
Yeah, Felicity, what would you expect on this front? And also, what does HB 24 unlock? Can you talk a little bit about that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is a really interesting, I think it's going to be very much, as Emily stated, a very mixed bag. I think there's going to be some of our larger cities that are absolutely excited, and I would even say eager to figure out how they can use SB 840, for example, to really help unlock commercial redevelopment in, say, the city of Dallas. But I think that there are some other places that are a little more hesitant, and there are brackets in some of these bills. So that means that only some, like we were talking about, that maybe that's top 20, 19 cities really have to think through this. But that could be a wide spectrum of that response. And as Emily mentioned, there is a cause of action to sort of help everyone keep in line, but I will see how that plays out. And implementation is something new to a lot of housing policy folks. Because we haven't had a statewide reform bill that's been as significant as, say, an SB 840. But I think to your other point is that we gave cities a great new tool to help them do some of this work, and that's HB 24. What we talked about earlier was the petition rights and how that relates to rezonings, and essentially that we had really empowered a lot of neighboring or adjacent property owners to have these valid petitions that then made it extremely hard. The threshold was three supermajority of a city council to actually have to support a rezoning case. And there was just this real sense of, oh, this is way out of line, because it's a 20% threshold of very easy to get a valid petition and then a very high threshold to pass at the municipal level. So we've really swapped that around. It's now a 60% requirement, and it's still a simple majority. So valid petitions have been, I would say, reassessed, and we'll see how those get used going forward. So are we going to lessen the opposition around some housing? Absolutely. And I think to your other point, we've really helped cities figure out how to do notification around comprehensive rezoning. And I know this is exciting for all of our Dallas folks because y'all are in that process already. And it's exciting to know that the city of Dallas has very clear set of rules come September 1st as to how they have to notify their citizens of what they're doing with their rezoning plans. And, they're collecting information right now and just starting that process. But the idea we would hope generally is that because they have that clarity, there's a less likelihood of lawsuits. They really know who and when people need to be notified as they make these zoning changes, and that there's a good sense from the community of course, we are aware what's happening with our comprehensive planning, and we're getting that information, and we feel comfortable with what's being suggested, versus it becoming this real battle of like, we didn't like the policy, so we're going to sue over the process, which is definitely the way it's been previously. And again, something I think the ledge was eager to get away from, to give cities the tools to do the changes that they needed so that they can unlock these new housing opportunities.
Ben, a lot of this, as we've talked about in the past, is really geared towards, market rate housing, or, the ledge basically did not put any new money into capital A affordable housing that's geared towards, folks who are lowest on the income ladder. Do you see anything in this package, even if it doesn't allocate money, that might help affordable housing developers, put together new projects and put new units on the ground?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, clearly anything that's going to increase supply or bring cheaper products to market is going to have an overall effect of stabilizing housing costs. I think that's pretty well studied. Our organization focuses, of course, on the housing needs of lowest income Texans, and that's where I think there's still some debate about where that line is, but there's generally agreement that there's a bit of a market failure going on for delivering housing products just using the free market for the lowest income households. We're always going to need some kind of subsidy or support to help house those renters, but it can, decrease their cost burden potentially. In particular, in terms of delivering like capital A affordable housing, valid petition reform is a big one. That stops market rate and capital A affordable developments all the same. And so, we particularly see kind of high wealth, high opportunity communities, often racially segregated communities, very hesitant to accept affordable housing in their communities, and using the tyrant's veto as a way to avoid having to take their fair share of affordable housing. So I see a potential positive impact there. But I do see this as a challenge, an opportunity, a further topic for coalition building, because I do think that going forward, what we mean by housing affordability or affordable housing at the ledge, what our legislators mean by it, is still absolutely contested space. I think, you have nearly 200 legislators across both the chambers, and I think you have nearly 200 ideas about what the outcome they're trying to achieve is, and what the tools are going to take to get there. But I do think that the legislature paying serious attention to low income housing needs is going to be more important in the years going forward, even than it already is. And that's because we're seeing, of course, the devolution effort at the federal level to block grant out more and more housing programs, as well as other administrative state programs, to the state level. So we are, I don't have a crystal ball, but it's absolutely within the realm of possibility that programs that we see as federal programs, HUD programs, are going to grant much more of that authority at the state level. And so having an approach, having a policy goal in mind, a vision for what housing affordability and just dignified housing for low income people looks like in the state of Texas, that's a tough road to walk, given the makeup of our legislature, but it is critically important right now.
I am going to start the audience Q&A a little bit early, just because I have my own questions in case you guys don't have any more. The first one that we've got is, how does the city of Dallas plan to incorporate the new laws set forth in SB 15? Emily, I think that's one for you. Something that we hear a lot in Dallas in terms of discussion around housing is that we've got all this vacant land sitting around in Dallas and in Fort Worth as well. How do you sort of expect SB 15 to be sort of implemented, not just in Dallas, but also, in some of these other areas, in other cities that are covered by the bill? How far do you expect it to go?
Sure. So SB 15 is a very narrow, very targeted approach towards reducing minimum lot sizes. There was a bill that got filed in 2023, and it was very sweeping. I think it may have started as like a 1,500 square foot minimum lot size statewide. And then it got whittled down, and it came very close to passing, but did not get all the way there. And so SB 15 was like very tailored. It was very thoughtful. It was very targeted to like undeveloped 5-acre plots of land in these big cities. So those exist. But it's gonna be pretty narrow. I also think that, you know, the bills are bracketed are look to housing in kind of a reactive way. And what I mean by that is these bills are targeted to our fast growth cities primarily, where land is expensive. And so we are going to have like going back in and you know, like reforming land use to infuse those cities with new housing at the point where we have like we needed this 10 or 15 years ago. So I think that one of the potentials for next session is to, you know, we're going to have our 1.5 years of implementation to see what kicks out. And then potentially look at expanding these further, because the way that you like proactively get ahead of high housing costs is like you let the market respond. So if you like maybe, I don't know, pick a small town. If you say, all right, in your small town, we're gonna implement a 3,000 square foot minimum lot size. You will likely not have any 3,000 square foot lots because land is still cheap there. But in the event that that small town, you know, maybe a chip processing plant gets put there, and land becomes more expensive, well, then you have the infrastructure in place to start building up these like lower cost plots. So I think that the best part about 15 is that it's going to provide somewhat of a laboratory for the rest of the state, and a signal that says, you know, the neighborhoods that will arise from this are more affordable. They are, you know, beautiful and walkable and good for families. And it will lessen the fear mongering that can arise from some of these issues, so that maybe in the future we can start using these land use reform tools as to get ahead of rising housing costs.
We have another question here from Stephanie Champion of Builders of Hope. Hi, Stephanie. She asks, what impact will SB 840 have on existing density bonus programs? How will it help or hinder efforts to include deeply affordable units in new multifamily developments? Not sure who's best to answer that, but anybody can jump in.
I'm going to jump in because the city of Austin is struggling with this exact same question. And in fact, I was just chatting with the folks about it because SB 40, it does change the game, honestly, regarding sort of density bonuses and how we've used them as a tool in the past. Basically, our two biggest cities, Dallas and Austin, that use them, we intentionally included it as part of the bill package so that we knew that they were still viable as a part of how you could do SB. So SB 840 does not preclude using a density bonus, and that was specifically called out in the final version. What it does do is challenge the math a little bit, because essentially you've created a situation where there's a base entitlement for most of our commercial zoning now that allows for a modest sized building. And when I say modest, it's between 45 and 60 feet generally. You know, there's a density limit, there's sort of setbacks and sizing, things like that. So you think most of these commercial buildings will end up being like that, but say you did want to build something bigger, that's when the density bonus might really come in, where you can still, as a city or municipality, ask for those additional units, some of which would be set aside as affordable housing. I think there's a question of how we can make those play together nicely, so to speak. What does it look like to have a version of SB 840 that does potentially have a little bit more height and includes affordable units? I think that's something the city of Austin wants to understand. Are there other ways we can use SB 840 to entice? So you're not really increasing the height per se, but you're maybe lessening some other restrictions. And in return, there are affordable units included. Those are the types of things that I think we're trying to work through and help cities understand, so that we can really ensure that SB 840 is seen as this kind of common floor, quite honestly, especially for our commercial zoning areas, and that then you can build on top of, like literally build on top of that, both in height and other ways, So kind of using all of the tools in the municipal toolbox to ensure that the version of SB 840 that unlocks affordable housing still exists. We just have to figure out what that looks like, quite honestly.
Can I jump in there real quick a little bit too? I agree with everything that Felicity just said. I do think that this question, Stephanie's question, is a very good one and really illustrates what I think we were talking about earlier about that contested space, about what housing affordability is and what the best approaches are to get there. Because having a comprehensive vision for where we want to go with housing is going to have to include approaches to both reducing housing costs overall and then using every tool in the toolbox, as Felicity said, for providing lowest income housing for people that the market is really going to struggle to serve, but who still deserve dignified housing. And the problem is that in the state of Texas, the local toolbox is like pretty sparse. There's only a couple tools in there, and density bonuses are one of the most important tool that cities in Texas still have to use to deliver that housing that the market's going to struggle to produce. So making sure that there's a robust ongoing conversation about how to pair land use reform with more targeted efforts for low-income households is really key.
Peter Stuckman asks, how can we as housing advocates ensure these bills are implemented as intended, especially in areas that are hesitant about housing reform, i.e. Dallas and Houston suburbs, or are simply not educated on it? Felicity, I think that sounds like you.
I was gonna say I'll jump in again. I think this is a really interesting, because we haven't been in this place before, and I think I mentioned when we spoke about implementation earlier, to understand, I'm really sincerely hopeful that most of our cities will get on board and will have at least an attempt to faithfully implement these new reforms that have passed. We do know from sort of other policy sectors that implementation post-ledge can be a mixed bag. And often we do end up having to come back. I think Emily made that point really well of like, when you pass something, that doesn't mean it's a done deal, just the opposite. And we haven't really talked about HFCs and PFCs on this call, but that's another area where we did some reform work from, when that got approved to when this, and that's a really a critical part. So first of all, I wouldn't say that what we're going to get right now is the final version. There's going to be additional sort of carrots and sticks, so to speak. But I think to your point about advocates, I'm very hopeful that the work that we've done at advocating at the ledge and the groups that we brought together will continue to be as vocal and as involved as we go back to our municipal areas, be that Fort Worth or Dallas or here in Austin. We have a role to play both at the Capitol, which I think we did very successfully on some of these, as well as locally. And I think that's a key thing, is that our voice was very, I think, powerful and strong. And we can bring those same conversations and say, hey, I talked to our state rep and he was in favor of SB 840. So like, how can I help you do the best version of this? So and let's face it, there's also a lot of technical nuance that we're going to get into here, where we're going to have to sit around a table and be like, what is the right way to do SB 15? So I think that is kind of a lot of there's an opportunity there that we should be excited about as advocates, quite honestly.
Austin Holmes asks, how are cities receiving, I'm sorry, Austin, I skipped over somebody else's question. Stephanie Bering asks, regarding SB 15, I'm hearing that it only applies to non-platted land. Is that correct? The entirety of Oak Cliff, when it was incorporated, did not bring in their plat. So any land that hasn't been developed has to be platted. So could that apply in that case?
I don't know the municipal structure of Oak Cliff. It's within the city of Dallas? So it's, yeah, I mean, I think so, as long as the plots are greater than 5 acres. Is that how you would take that, Felicity?
Yeah, so I was going to say there is an acreage requirement as well as the unplatted. So it's not only just you have an unplatted piece of land, it's also that it's over 5 acres. So in theory, you could, I guess, actually have a land assemblage, so to speak, where you get over 5 acres in Oak Cliff that was unplatted, and then you would be able to use SB 15. I think that's going to be a really interesting question, because when they looked at, I think Emily again did a great, we were trying to create a more targeted minimum lot size. So, you don't do anything perfectly at the ledge, believe me. Everything does end up having some unintended consequences. And a situation like that, where there's an older subdivision or a smaller municipality that has basically a lot of unplatted land because of the way their structure was set up, that's something where we'd probably have to work through. And quite honestly, that is a potential place where you could use HB 24 to do a zoning that actually sort of resolves the issue of the conflict potentially between SB 15 and what the residents would like to see, which is probably not a raising of all of their housing and then something like, a suburban developer coming in. Because again, there's a sort of intent with a lot of these bills, which is this was greenfield's minimum lot size, not designed to sort of disrupt current and existing neighborhoods through a technicality.
So seeing Brian's note that we're going to have closing remarks here in a couple minutes, and that they're going to get any questions that aren't asked to the panel afterwards for answers. I'm going to take the opportunity to jump in and ask, kind of what is one thing that you guys think should have made it over the line or was undiscussed or under discussed at the ledge this year that should make a comeback, and that the ledge should seriously consider next time. John, I'll start with you.
Sure. I mean, I would say the lowest hanging fruit for this answer would be Senator Parker's bill. The thing that really would have been nice if it were discussed is a sustainable revenue source from the state to address homelessness. The biggest thing for us is we've got a supportive county, we've got a supportive federal government at this moment in time, we've got a supportive city. The state providing additional resources to support our folks experiencing issues with mental health, behavioral health, would allow us to better tackle some of the more complex needs. I mean, the reality is that homelessness is not a moral failing. It's a reflection of a system that's not working for everybody, and that includes the affordability of housing. So if the state were to be able to contribute towards what is working as a system that's catching people falling into homelessness and either diverting them, rehousing them, it's an expensive thing to do, but it is also the most cost-effective way to address the homelessness issue here. So, I would say the state contributing more funds, if that were in bill form, would be on my wish list. But in terms of things that were tried and didn't make it across, Senator Parker's bill for sure would be one that I think of.
Thanks, John. Ben, what's your answer?
Yeah, so I already talked a little bit about the urgent need for the legislature to focus on funding for lowest income housing. I want to do a twist on that with this final answer and say we really need to get our story straight as housing advocates about workforce housing. Workforce housing is kind of a dirty word in my mind, because when I hear workforce housing, I hear we're subsidizing housing that if Felicity and Emily's land use deregulation efforts work, we shouldn't need to subsidize. The market will produce that. We need to reserve our direct housing support from the public sector for lowest income housing that can't be served by the market. And we have way too much confusion at the Capitol on that. So we've seen reform. Felicity referred to reform to the PFC tool. There was reform this session under House Bill 21 to Housing Finance Corporation tax exemptions. There's another similar tool that housing authorities use that I think it's pretty clear is going to be under the microscope next session. But really, I think we need to look at all of those state tools. We're calling them now tax-exempt private partnerships, to have a very clear policy idea of what we're trying to achieve, what type of housing are these tools supposed to produce, and then to create predictable expectations and uniform expectations among all of these tax exemptions floating around in statute, to make sure that they're working to produce housing that the market can't produce. And then again, hopefully it goes without saying, capitalizing on the increased interest and momentum around tenant protections this section to raise awareness among legislators on those issues. There's so much that can be done.
Thanks, Ben. Over to you, Felicity.
So I'm going to start with my obscure one because we're really excited about this, and I'm going to say something people are probably not expecting, which is elevator reform. That's actually one of these technical codes that it's interesting seeing Florida was sort of doing this, and now Texas hopefully will be jumping on the bandwagon, where if you have a large state that leads on something that's kind of a technical issue, that you set a national precedent that can then be followed by other states. I think we've done a really great job with that with our single stair bill. And along the same lines, for those of you not aware, an elevator is really expensive and it causes a lot of harm in multifamily buildings in particular, especially when you have to have dual access because you have to have two egress, ingress. Anyway, as I said, it gets really technical really fast, but reforming elevators so that we have more choice in the marketplace, that it's less of a constricted market that's really driven by contracts and specifically some big manufacturing firms. If we even get a tiny bit of reform done at the next legislative session in Texas, that sets up kind of a national domino effect, so to speak, of what we can do here because we're such a big state is impactful. And I would just say that across the board, when we're talking about some of these things, Texas does set the tone for a lot of housing conversations. And we're excited this session that we've had some really positive ones, but that also means that we're now a leader in a good way, I think. And to Ben's point, we should be, if we can lead on things like better tenant protections or better tools for affordable housing, that's great because just like Florida did with their Live Local Act, it sets a tone and sets everyone up, conservative or liberal, to say, hey, this is the way we should be thinking about housing, both, market rate and affordable. Look what Texas has done. And I think that's the energy we want to bring into the next session. For me, it's definitely maybe on something technical like elevators, but I think across the board, seeing ourselves as leaders and positioning ourselves as a result on a lot of these housing issues in that way, I think is going to be critical.
Emily, you get the last word on this.
Well, I have a few, but I'll try and go fast. The first one I would like to see next session is my pet project, which is getting rid of minimum house square footage requirements. Lots of cities across the state not only have a minimum lot size, but they have a minimum size that your house has to be. That can be as high as 1,500 or 2,000 square feet, which means we've effectively regulated starter homes out of existence. So I would like to see that one brought up next session. I also think that we need to get really serious about resilience as a theme going forward. Extreme weather will only continue to get worse. We need to make sure that our neighborhoods are able to withstand extreme weather, that homeowners are able to harden their homes without penalties from HOAs or cities. And then we can extend that kind of idea of resilience to, using housing as a non-medical driver of health. We are all subject to urban design, and it is not something that you can get out of just by earning more money. So we need to really get serious about how our built environment affects our physical and mental health.
All right. Thanks so much for the lively discussion, y'all. This was good. And thank y'all at the Dallas Housing Coalition for putting this together. Brian, I'm handing it off to you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Joshua, and everybody for joining us today. We topped out at, I believe, 57 online people in the Zoom room alone. And then I'm sure we have tens and hundreds more who will watch this after the fact on the Dallas Housing Coalition's Facebook, LinkedIn, X, and YouTube channels. I'd like to thank our Dallas Housing Coalition board members and steering committee who are here today, our interns who helped with registration and making sure the Zoom ran smoothly. Thank you to our members who joined and staying on mute and asking phenomenal questions. We'll get these answered for you that we didn't have time for. And there were several elected official staffs who I believe were in attendance already, and other champions like Nathan Johnson, Rafael Anchia, Mark Vesey, and Chad West locally, who we enjoy working with and appreciate your support. For our members, Felicity touched on this, comprehensive zoning reform. Public meetings are starting tonight in Southern Oak Cliff at Cedar Crest, tomorrow night in East Dallas at Samuel Grand Rec Center, and on Thursday night in North Dallas at Churchill Recreation Center. Please try and make one of those if you can to advocate for more housing choice and access. We'll be doing a series of zoning workshops and community talks hopefully this fall. So stay tuned for that, as well as mark your calendars for August 12th when we're hosting Sarah Bronin, author of Key to the City, How Zoning Shapes the World Around Us, Tuesday, August 12th in the evening, and our second annual Housing Summit. It will be scheduled to take place on Friday, November 21st at UNT Dallas. Please call, text, or donate, join the Dallas Housing Coalition, continue to share this webinar and our work with people in your network and your neighbors. None of this advocacy would be possible without our members and your support, both in kind and financial support. We've really accomplished a lot this session, and I think this panel, goes to show how much we've done. So we look forward to, more in the next couple of years, working in the interim on different studies and building more housing capacity and support regionally. So I will end it there at 12:59. And thank you all again for joining us. Have a great rest of your day and stay cool out there. We're turning off the live stream.